The unexpected assignment. The Nebula Hawk was no ordinary military ship. It carried the finest minds and the most advanced technology humanity had ever produced. Deep in the engineering bay, Ethan Blake was busy fine-tuning the ship's stabilizers when the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Lieutenant Blake, report to the captain's office immediately." Ethan sighed, wiping his hands on his uniform. Interruptions were common, but this sounded urgent. With one last glance at the glowing control panel, he left the engineering bay, his boots echoing in the sterile metal corridors of the ship. The captain's office was intimidating, with its wide desk and the imposing figure of Captain Holden behind it. Ethan stood at attention, unsure of what to expect. The captain's piercing eyes met his, and she gestured for him to sit. "Lieutenant Blake, we have a situation," Captain Holden began, her tone firm. "Due to a systems failure in the crew quarters, we need to reassign living arrangements." Ethan nodded. It seemed straightforward enough. "Of course, Captain. Where will I be relocated?" Holden's expression hardened. "You won't be relocating. Someone will be moving in with you." Ethan frowned. Sharing quarters was rare, especially for someone like him who valued solitude. "Who?" The captain tapped a button on her desk, and the door behind Ethan slid open with a soft hiss. He turned, and his breath caught. Standing in the doorway was an alien woman, tall and striking. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft silver hue that reflected the light like liquid metal. Her eyes were a vivid purple, scanning the room with a mixture of confidence and amusement. Her uniform, though standard military issue, seemed tailored to accentuate her lithe figure. "This is Lieutenant Lyra from the planet Velinus," Holden said. "She'll be sharing your quarters for the foreseeable future." Ethan's jaw tightened. Velinesians were known for their charm and beauty, but they were also infamous for being manipulative. Lyra's kind could emit pheromones that influenced emotions, making them dangerously persuasive. "With all due respect, Captain," Ethan said carefully, "is this really necessary? The engineering bay is a high-security area, and I need to stay focused." "I understand your concerns," Holden replied, her voice unyielding. "But Lyra's skills are crucial to our mission. You'll make it work." Lyra stepped forward, her movements graceful. "Don't worry, engineer," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I promise not to disrupt your little world." Ethan stiffened. Her tone was teasing, almost mocking, and it set his nerves on edge. He didn't respond, simply nodding to the captain before leaving the office with Lyra trailing behind him. The walk back to his quarters was silent, but Ethan could feel her gaze on him. When they reached the door, he entered his access code, and the panel slid open. The room was small but meticulously organized. Tools, manuals, and data pads were neatly arranged on shelves. A bunk bed was built into one wall, and a compact desk faced a monitor displaying schematics. Lyra stepped inside, her sharp eyes taking in the room. She ran a finger along the edge of a shelf, examining the spotless surface. "Functional. Predictable. Boring," she said, smirking. Ethan clenched his jaw. "This is a military ship, not a luxury resort." She chuckled, sitting on the lower bunk and crossing her legs. "Relax, engineer. I'm not here to redecorate, but you might want to loosen up. Sharing quarters could be fun." "I don't need fun," Ethan muttered, unpacking a toolkit from his bag. "I need to do my job." Lyra tilted her head, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You don't trust me, do you?" Ethan paused. "It's not about trust. I just don't understand why someone like you is on this ship." Her smile faded slightly, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something serious in her eyes. "Let's just say I have my reasons." Before he could press further, the ship's lights flickered, and a low hum reverberated through the walls. Ethan straightened, his instincts kicking in. What was that? Lyra stood, her demeanor shifting. "Looks like your precious ship has a problem." Ethan grabbed his communicator. Engineering, report. A voice crackled through the device. Lieutenant, we're experiencing a power fluctuation in the starboard engine. Systems are stable for now, but we need a full diagnostic. Ethan was already heading for the door, his mind racing with possibilities. Lyra followed him, her playful attitude replaced by a sharp focus that surprised him. Do you always follow people? Ethan asked as they hurried through the corridor. Lyra shrugged. Consider it my way of bonding. Besides, I might be more useful than you think. Ethan doubted that, but he didn't have time to argue. The ship's stability was his responsibility, and he wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, distract him. Yet, as they entered the engineering bay and Lyra's gaze swept over the consoles with keen interest, he couldn't shake the feeling that her presence was far from accidental. And that thought made his unease grow even stronger. Clashing personalities. Ethan Blake had never imagined he'd share his living quarters with anyone, let alone an alien whose every movement seemed designed to test his patience. Lyra, the Villanesian officer now assigned to his cabin, was proving to be more than just a minor inconvenience. In the few hours since their forced cohabitation began, she'd already rearranged some of his shelves, commented on his excessive neatness, and, most infuriatingly, hummed a haunting melody that made it impossible for him to focus. It was late evening aboard the Nebula Hawk. Ethan sat at his compact desk, reviewing the engine diagnostics on his monitor. The power fluctuation earlier had been minor, but something about it gnawed at him. Systems didn't just glitch without cause, and he intended to find the reason. Behind him, Lyra lounged on the lower bunk, flipping through a holo magazine she'd pulled from her bag. Her silvery skin shimmered under the cabin's dim lights, and her luminous purple eyes darted between the holographic images and Ethan. The silence between them was heavy, but not peaceful. Ethan could feel her watching him, and it grated on his nerves. Do you always work this late? Lyra asked, breaking the quiet. Ethan didn't look up. When there's work to do, yes. She smirked, sitting up and leaning forward. You humans take life so seriously. Always working, always worrying. Don't you ever just live? I'm living just fine, Ethan replied curtly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Lyra chuckled. If this is your idea of living, no wonder you're so grumpy. Ethan finally turned to face her, his expression exasperated. Look, Lieutenant Lyra, I don't need a lecture on how to enjoy life. I have a job to do, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't. He stopped mid-sentence as she stood and moved closer, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. You'd appreciate it if I didn't what? She asked, her voice a soft purr. Distract you, challenge you, make you uncomfortable. Ethan stood as well, keeping his distance. Distract me, for starters. And while we're at it, could you maybe stop touching everything? I have a system. Lyra raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. A system? Is that what you call this obsession with order? Humans and their rules. She walked over to one of his meticulously arranged shelves and picked up a small tool, examining it closely. Put that back, Ethan said firmly. Lyra smirked, twirling the tool in her hand. Relax, engineer. I'm not going to break it. Lyra, I mean it, he said, his voice rising. I don't have time for your games. Her smile faltered, and for a moment, her playful demeanor was replaced by something colder. Games. You think this is a game to me? Ethan hesitated. There was an edge to her voice now, something he hadn't expected. I didn't mean. Forget it, she interrupted, placing the tool back with more force than necessary. She turned her back to him and returned to the bunk, her movements stiff. I'll stay out of your way. The tension in the room was palpable, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not used to sharing space. It's nothing personal. Lyra glanced at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Everything is personal, Ethan. Before he could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. All personnel, report to your stations immediately. Possible external threat detected. Ethan's stomach dropped. An external threat? On the edge of the galaxy that could mean anything. Pirates, rogue ships, or worse. Without a word, he grabbed his toolkit and headed for the door. "Wait," Lyra said, standing. "I'm coming with you." Ethan stopped, turning to face her. "This is an engineering issue, not a—" "I'm coming," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Like it or not, we're in this together." Ethan clenched his jaw but didn't argue. There was no time. Together, they made their way to the engineering bay, the corridors buzzing with activity as crew members rushed to their stations. When they arrived, the bay was a flurry of motion. Technicians worked frantically at their consoles, and the hum of machinery filled the air. Chief Engineer Carson spotted Ethan and waved him over. "Blake, we've got a problem," Carson said, his voice tense. "An unidentified ship just appeared on our scanners. It's not responding to hails, and our long-range sensors are acting up. I need you to stabilize the comms array." Ethan nodded, already heading for the nearest console. Lyra followed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Do you even know what you're looking at?" Ethan asked as she stopped beside him. "I've dealt with worse," she replied, her tone cool. "And for the record, your comms array isn't the only thing malfunctioning. That power fluctuation earlier, it wasn't random." Ethan froze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone, or something, wants this ship vulnerable," Lyra said, her voice low. "And if we don't figure out why, this external threat might be the least of our problems." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. He didn't trust her, but her words made a disturbing kind of sense. As alarms blared and the ship's systems continued to glitch, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary malfunction. The real question was, who, or what, was behind it? The sabotage. The Nebula Hawk hummed with tension as the alarms blared across the ship. Crew members scrambled to their stations, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. In the engineering bay, Ethan Blake worked frantically at his console, trying to stabilize the comms array. Beside him, Lara stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the chaos around them. "I don't like this," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "You're not supposed to," Ethan shot back, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "This isn't a simulation." Liara ignored his jab, her gaze narrowing as she noticed something on a nearby monitor. "That's not right." Ethan paused, glancing over. "What?" She pointed to a readout displaying power distribution across the ship. "The fluctuations. They're not random. Look at the pattern." Ethan frowned, leaning closer. The data was erratic, but as he studied it, a pattern began to emerge. The power surges seemed to originate from the auxiliary systems, but they were deliberately rerouting through critical pathways, creating instability. "Someone's doing this on purpose," he realized, his voice grim. Liara nodded. "Sabotage." Before Ethan could respond, Chief Engineer Carson stormed over, his face red with frustration. "Blake, what's the status on that comms array?" "It's not the comms, Chief," Ethan said quickly. "This is sabotage. Someone's manipulating the power grid." Carson's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, gesturing to the monitor. "Look at the distribution. It's too deliberate to be a system failure." Carson cursed under his breath. "All right, find the source and shut it down. We can't afford any more." Before he could finish, a deafening explosion rocked the ship. The engineering bay shook violently, and sparks rained down from overhead conduits. Ethan grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself, his heart pounding. "What the hell was that?" Carson barked, his voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. "Explosion in the engine room," a technician shouted from across the bay. "Damage to the primary thrusters." Ethan's stomach sank. If the primary thrusters were compromised, the ship would be left drifting, a sitting target for any hostile forces. He turned to Lara, who was already moving toward the exit. "Where are you going?" he called after her. "To the engine room," she replied without looking back. "We need to see the damage firsthand." Ethan hesitated for a split second before following her. As much as he disliked her presence, he couldn't deny that she had a knack for thinking ahead. Together, they navigated the crowded corridors, dodging panicked crew members and falling debris. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, and the emergency lights cast an eerie red glow over everything. When they reached the engine room, the scene was worse than Ethan had feared. One of the primary thruster cores was completely destroyed, its casing shattered and leaking coolant. Engineers worked desperately to contain the damage, but it was clear the situation was critical. "This wasn't just sabotage," Lyra said, her voice low. "This was a calculated attack." Ethan followed her gaze to a section of the wall where a small device was embedded, its blinking light indicating that it was still active. "A detonation charge," he said, his throat tightening. Whoever planted it knew exactly where to hit. Lyra crouched beside the device, examining it carefully. "This tech isn't human," she said after a moment. "It's Vilanisian." Ethan's blood ran cold. "You're saying your people did this?" "I'm saying someone wants it to look that way," Lyra replied sharply. "But this isn't standard Vilanisian design. It's a counterfeit." Ethan stared at her, trying to process her words. "Why would someone frame your people?" "To sow distrust," Lyra said simply. "If the crew starts believing Vilanisians are behind this, it'll tear the ship apart from the inside." Ethan hated how logical her explanation sounded. The tension between humans and Vilanisians was already fragile. This could push it over the edge. But there was no time to dwell on it. The ship was in immediate danger, and they needed answers fast. "We need to disarm this," he said, kneeling beside her. Lyra glanced at him. "You sure you know what you're doing?" "I'm an engineer," he said, pulling out his toolkit. "I've disarmed explosives before." She raised an eyebrow. "Let's hope you're as good as you think." As Ethan worked to disable the charge, Lyra stood guard, her sharp gaze scanning the room for any sign of trouble. The tension was palpable, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, with a soft click, the device powered down, its blinking light going dark. "It's disarmed," Ethan said, exhaling in relief. "Good," Lyra said, her tone clipped. "But this is far from over. Whoever planted that device is still out there." Ethan nodded grimly. "And we need to find them before they strike again." As they left the engine room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing. Still, the unease lingered, a constant reminder that the Nebula Hawk was no longer the safe haven it once was. And for the first time, he found himself wondering if Lyra's presence aboard the ship was more than just coincidence. Secrets in the dark. The Nebula Hawk had settled into an uneasy calm after the explosion, but Ethan Blake couldn't shake the lingering tension. The sabotage had left the crew shaken and the ship vulnerable. Repairs to the thrusters were underway, but trust among the crew was beginning to fray. Whispers of conspiracy spread like wildfire, and the unease was palpable in every corridor. Ethan was in the engineering bay, poring over system logs in a desperate attempt to find clues about the saboteur. His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing concrete presented itself. The thought of another attack kept him on edge. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Most of the crew was asleep, but Ethan knew rest wouldn't come easily for him tonight. As he stared at the data, a faint sound caught his attention. Footsteps, light and deliberate, echoed down the corridor outside the engineering bay. Frowning, he stood and moved to the door, peering out cautiously. The hallway was dimly lit, and at first he saw nothing. But then a shadow moved, a figure slipping silently toward the cargo hold. Ethan's pulse quickened. The curfew was in effect, and unauthorized movement at this hour was highly suspicious. He followed the figure, keeping his footsteps light. As he got closer, he recognized the fluid grace of the person's movements. It was Lyra. Ethan's brow furrowed. What was she doing sneaking around in the middle of the night? His initial instinct was to confront her, but curiosity won out. He decided to follow her, staying far enough back to avoid detection. Lyra led him to the lower decks, where the ship's vast cargo hold stretched like an endless cavern. Crates of supplies and equipment were stacked in neat rows, casting long shadows under the dim emergency lighting. Lyra moved with purpose, weaving through the maze of containers until she reached a secluded corner. Ethan ducked behind a crate, watching as she crouched down and pulled a small device from her pocket. She tapped a few buttons, and a faint holographic display flickered to life. The light from the device illuminated her face, revealing an expression far more serious than her usual playful demeanor. "What are you doing?" Ethan said, stepping out from his hiding place. Lyra spun around, her hand darting to her side, as if reaching for a weapon. When she saw it was Ethan, she relaxed slightly but didn't lower her guard. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low. "Neither should you," Ethan shot back. He nodded toward the device in her hand. "What's that?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze darting between Ethan and the device. Finally, she sighed and stood, tucking the device into her pocket. "It's a communicator." "For what?" Ethan pressed. "You're not supposed to have unauthorized equipment. Are you sending messages to someone outside the ship?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm trying to prevent another attack." Ethan crossed his arms. "That's convenient. And why should I believe you?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm not your enemy, Ethan. I'm here to find the person who is." Ethan's skepticism deepened. "And you couldn't tell me that before?" "I didn't think you'd trust me," she admitted. "And I wasn't wrong." "Then why tell me now?" "Because I don't have a choice," Lyra said. "The saboteur is dangerous, and I can't stop them alone. Whether you like it or not, I need your help." Ethan studied her, his instincts warring with logic. He didn't trust her, couldn't trust her, but her words rang with a truth he couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "Start talking. What do you know?" Lyra glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. The sabotage wasn't random. "Someone is trying to cripple the Nebula Hawk before we reach the rendezvous point. I've been tracking unusual activity for weeks, encrypted messages, unauthorized access to restricted areas. Whoever they are, they're smart. And you're sure it's not one of your people?" Ethan asked pointedly. Lyra's expression hardened. "It's not Villanisian. I've already told you. Someone is framing us." The device in the engine room was a counterfeit, designed to make you think my people are involved. But the design was sloppy, too many inconsistencies. Ethan processed her words, his mind racing. "If you're telling the truth, we need to act fast. Another attack could destroy the ship." Lyra nodded. "Exactly. That's why I need access to the ship's security logs. I can trace the messages and find out who's behind this." Ethan hesitated. "Those logs are classified. If we're caught accessing them, do you want to stop the saboteur or not?" Lyra interrupted, her tone sharp. Ethan sighed. She had a point. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. No more sneaking around." Lyra smirked faintly, a hint of her usual playfulness returning. "Deal." They made their way to the ship's security hub, their steps careful and deliberate. As they worked together to bypass the system's safeguards, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a dangerous line. If they failed, the consequences would be severe. But as Lyra leaned over the console, her sharp eyes scanning the data with practiced precision, Ethan felt a flicker of something unexpected. Trust. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't the enemy after all. Betrayal and alliance. The dim light of the security hub cast long shadows over the room as Ethan and Lyra worked in tense silence. Ethan's hands moved swiftly across the console, bypassing layers of encryption to access the ship's restricted security logs. Beside him, Lyra's sharp eyes scanned the data as it appeared on the monitor. "This is it," Lyra whispered, pointing to a string of timestamps. "Encrypted messages sent during the power fluctuations." Ethan leaned closer, frowning. "The source of these messages is here, on the ship." Lyra nodded grimly. "I told you. The saboteur is one of us." Ethan stared at the screen, a cold weight settling in his chest. "If this gets out, it'll tear the crew apart." "That's why we need proof," Lyra said. "Keep digging." As Ethan traced the messages back to their origin, his heart sank. The log showed a terminal in the officers' quarters, a terminal registered to Lieutenant Commander Daryl Hayes, a senior officer and someone Ethan had worked with for years. "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "It can't be Hayes. He's one of the most trusted people on this ship." Lyra's expression was unreadable. Trust can be a dangerous thing. Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was clear. "We need to confront him." Lyra placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Not yet. If Hayes is the saboteur, he's dangerous. Rushing in without a plan will get us killed." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Then what do we do?" Lyra's lips curved into a faint smirk. "We set a trap." The plan was simple but risky. Lyra and Ethan would plant false information in the ship's systems, baiting Hayes into revealing himself. If he was truly the saboteur, he wouldn't be able to resist acting on the data. The challenge was executing the plan without tipping him off. Hours later, Ethan and Lyra hid in a shadowed maintenance bay, monitoring the ship's internal systems. The false data they had planted indicated that a critical security code had been left unguarded, a code that could grant access to the ship's weapon systems. "It's a gamble," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery around them. Lyra smirked. "Life's more fun with a little risk." Ethan shot her a look. "This isn't fun. This is life or death." Her expression softened slightly. "I know. But if we pull this off, we save the ship." Minutes ticked by like hours as they watched the monitor. Suddenly, a red alert flashed on the screen. Someone was accessing the false data. "Got him," Ethan whispered. The terminal ID matched Hayes' quarters. Ethan's stomach twisted. It was one thing to suspect Hayes. It was another to see undeniable proof. "We need to move," Lyra said, already heading for the door. Ethan followed, his heart pounding. Together, they made their way to Hayes' quarters, their steps silent on the metal floor. When they reached the door, Lyra motioned for Ethan to stay back. She pulled a compact weapon from her belt, a sleek Villanisian stun gun. "You're armed," Ethan whispered, his eyes narrowing. "Always," she replied. "Don't worry. I won't kill them, unless I have to." Ethan swallowed hard as Lyra tapped the door's access panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Hayes sitting at his desk, his back to them. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice them enter. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," Lyra said, her voice cold and sharp. "Step away from the terminal." Hayes froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly he turned, his eyes narrowing when he saw Lyra and Ethan. "What's the meaning of this?" "You tell us," Ethan said, his voice shaking with anger. "We know you've been sabotaging the ship." Hayes' expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Blake." Lyra stepped closer, her stun gun trained on him. "The only mistake here is yours. We have the logs. We know you've been sending encrypted messages and planting devices. Care to explain why?" For a moment, Hayes said nothing. Then, to Ethan's shock, he smiled. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said, his tone almost mocking. "But you're too late." Before Ethan or Lyra could react, Hayes pressed a button on his desk. An ear-splitting alarm filled the room, and the lights flickered ominously. "What did you do?" Ethan shouted. Hayes laughed. "You'll find out soon enough." Lyra didn't hesitate. She fired the stun gun, and Hayes collapsed to the floor, unconscious. She stepped over his body and examined the console. "This isn't good," she muttered. He triggered a countdown. "There's a second explosive device somewhere on the ship." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Where?" Liara tapped furiously at the console, her expression grim. "The cargo hold. If it goes off, it'll breach the hull." Ethan's mind raced. They had minutes, maybe less, to stop the device. "We need to move. Now." Liara nodded, her usual smirk replaced by a look of steely determination. "Let's say your ship, engineer." As they sprinted through the corridors, the ship's alarm blared around them, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Ethan's legs burned, but he pushed himself harder, fueled by adrenaline and fear. When they reached the cargo hold, they found the device tucked behind a stack of crates. It was larger and more complex than the one in the engine room, its timer ticking down ominously. "Can you disarm it?" Liara asked. Ethan dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he examined the device. "I'll try." As he worked, Liara kept watch, her weapon ready. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, with just seconds to spare, Ethan cut the final wire. The timer stopped, the device going silent. Ethan sat back, his chest heaving with relief. "We did it." Liara offered him a hand, pulling him to his feet. "Nice work, Blake. Maybe you're not so boring after all." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Don't get used to it." As they left the cargo hold, the weight of their victory began to sink in. The saboteur had been stopped, but Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Whoever had orchestrated the sabotage wasn't working alone, and the Nebula Hawk still had a long journey ahead. And despite everything, Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing respect for the alien woman walking beside him. Together, they might just stand a chance against whatever came next. The final mission. The air aboard the Nebula Hawk felt heavier in the aftermath of the confrontation with Hayes. The unconscious saboteur had been secured in the brig, but his cryptic warning still echoed in Ethan's mind. "You're too late." Something about the way he'd said it made Ethan's stomach churn. Hayes might have been stopped, but it was clear the threat to the ship wasn't over. Ethan and Liara stood in the captain's office, facing Captain Holden and Chief Engineer Carson. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Lieutenant Blake, Lieutenant Liara," Holden began, her piercing gaze sweeping over them. "You've done commendable work uncovering Hayes' sabotage. But if what you're saying is true, that there's a larger plot at play, we're far from safe." Ethan nodded. The explosive in the cargo hold was only part of it. Hayes wasn't working alone. Someone else is pulling the strings. "And they're still on this ship," Liara added. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fury that Ethan was beginning to recognize. "Whoever it is, they've been careful, but we'll find them." Holden folded her arms, her expression grave. "You'd better. Because if we fail, this ship, and everyone on it, will be lost." Back in the engineering bay, Ethan and Liara worked side by side, combing through every system log, every piece of data they could find. The saboteur's trail was faint, like footprints in shifting sand, but it was there. Every so often, Liara would make a sharp comment or tease Ethan about his human stubbornness. But there was a new dynamic between them now, a fragile but growing trust. "There," Liara said, pointing to the monitor. "That's it. The signal Hayes used to trigger the cargo hold bomb. It matches another signal we intercepted earlier." Ethan frowned, leaning closer. "This one's different. It's coming from the auxiliary control room." Liara's eyes narrowed. "That's a restricted area." Ethan's pulse quickened. If someone's accessing it, they're either authorized or they don't care about getting caught. "Either way," Liara said, standing, "we need to get down there. Now." The auxiliary control room was located deep within the ship, far from the bustling corridors of the upper decks. As Ethan and Liara approached, the hum of the ship's engine seemed louder, almost oppressive. The door to the control room was sealed, but a faint light flickered beneath it, a sign that someone was inside. "Got a plan?" Ethan whispered, his hand hovering over the access panel. Liara smirked, pulling out her Villainesian stun gun. "I go in first. You follow my lead." Before Ethan could argue, she pressed her hand to the access panel, overriding the lock with a quick series of commands. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a figure hunched over the control console. The figure turned, startled, and Ethan's heart sank. It was Lieutenant Callan, one of the ship's navigation officers, a quiet, unassuming man who'd served aboard the Nebula Hawk for years. "Callan?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Callan's eyes darted between Ethan and Liara, his expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "You shouldn't be here." "And neither should you," Liara said coldly, stepping forward with her weapon raised. "Step away from the console." Callan hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't about sabotage, it's about survival." Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "They're coming," Callan said, his eyes wide with desperation. "The ones who sent Hayes. They'll be here soon. If we're not ready, we'll all die." "Who's coming?" Liara demanded. Callan shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. But I can stop them, if you let me finish." Liara exchanged a glance with Ethan, her grip tightening on her weapon. "We don't have time for riddles. Shut down whatever you're doing, or I will." Callan's expression hardened. "If you stop me, you'll doom us all." Ethan stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Callan, listen to me. If there's a threat, we need to know what it is. But this," he gestured to the console, "this isn't the way to handle it." Callan hesitated, his hand shaking. "You don't understand. They're already here." Before Ethan or Liara could respond, the ship shuddered violently, throwing them off balance. Alarms blared, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain Holden to all personnel. We are under attack. Unknown vessel has entered range. All hands to battle stations." Callan's face twisted with despair. "It's too late." Liara didn't hesitate. She fired her stun gun, and Callan collapsed, unconscious. Ethan rushed to the console, scanning the data on the screen. "What do you see?" Liara asked, her voice tight. Ethan's stomach churned. Callan wasn't lying. "There's a ship, a massive one, approaching at high speed, and it's armed to the teeth." Back on the bridge, chaos reigned. The attacking vessel loomed on the main display, its dark, angular design unlike anything Ethan had seen before. It bristled with weapons, and its shields shimmered ominously. "Status," Captain Holden barked, her voice cutting through the noise. "Shields are holding, but barely," a technician replied. "Their weapons are off the charts. We've never seen anything like this." Ethan and Liara entered the bridge, their presence drawing the captain's attention. "What the hell is going on, Blake?" "Callan was working with Hayes," Ethan said quickly. "He said the attack was inevitable. He was trying to prepare for this." Holden's eyes narrowed. "And now it's here. Suggestions?" Ethan glanced at Liara, then back at the captain. "We fight, but we'll need every advantage we can get." Liara nodded. "Start with disabling their weapons. If we can buy ourselves time, we might find a way to outmaneuver them." The captain hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Do it." As the ship shuddered under the barrage of enemy fire, Ethan and Liara exchanged a look. The odds were against them, but for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. They were a team now, and together, they might just survive. Redemption and new beginnings. The Nebula Hawk shuddered under the relentless barrage of enemy fire. Sparks flew from overhead panels, and the emergency lights bathed the bridge in an ominous red glow. Ethan Blake stood at the engineering console, sweat dripping from his brow, as he worked furiously to reroute power to the failing shields. "Shields at 23%, Captain." A crew member called out. "Keep them up as long as you can." Captain Holden barked, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Weapons, target their propulsion systems. Slow them down." But the enemy ship, a massive angular monstrosity bristling with weapons, seemed to anticipate every move. Its weapons tore through the Nebula Hawk's defenses with terrifying precision. Ethan glanced at Liara, who stood beside him, her purple eyes fixed on the tactical display. Despite the chaos, she radiated a calm intensity, as if she were calculating their every move. "We can't keep this up," Ethan said, his voice strained. "We need an edge." Liara didn't look at him, but tapped the console in front of her. "Their ship is using a reactive shield matrix. Every time we fire, it recalibrates to counter our weapons." But, Ethan prompted, his fingers still flying over his controls. A faint smirk tugged at Liara's lips. "If we overload their sensors with false data, we can disrupt the recalibration process. It'll give us a window to hit them where it hurts." Ethan frowned. "That's risky. If we get it wrong." "We won't," she interrupted. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw not just determination but trust. "Do you believe me, engineer?" Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let's do it." A desperate plan. Liara and Ethan worked in perfect synchronization, their earlier tensions forgotten as they focused on the task at hand. Liara fed false data into the enemy ship's systems, while Ethan rerouted power to the Nebula Hawk's main weapons. "Target locked," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "All systems ready." Captain Holden's gaze shifted between them. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Ethan admitted, "but it's our best shot." Holden nodded. "Do it." Liara hit the final command, and the Nebula Hawk fired. The enemy ship's shields flickered, their reactive matrix overwhelmed by the flood of false data. For a brief, precious moment, a gap appeared in their defenses. "Fire everything we've got," Holden ordered. The Nebula Hawk's weapons unleashed a devastating barrage, striking the enemy ship's propulsion systems. Explosions rippled along its hull, and the massive vessel began to drift, its weapons falling silent. The aftermath. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Ethan barely noticed. His hands trembled as he leaned against the console, his body sagging with relief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. Liara stepped beside him, her usual smirk replaced by a rare smile. "Not bad for a human." Ethan chuckled weakly. "Not bad for an alien." Before either of them could say more, Captain Holden approached. "Blake, Liara, what you two just pulled off saved this ship. I don't know what's going on between you, but whatever it is, it works." Ethan felt his cheeks flush, but Liara merely shrugged. "We're just a good team, Captain." Holden's expression softened. "Good work, both of you. Now, get some rest. You've earned it." A quiet moment. Hours later, as the ship's systems returned to normal, and the crew began assessing the damage, Ethan found himself back in his quarters. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his hands. The events of the past few days felt surreal, like a half-remembered dream. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up as Liara stepped inside, her usual confidence tempered by something softer. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Ethan shook his head. "Too much to process." She walked over and sat beside him, her proximity both comforting and unsettling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You did good, Ethan," she said finally. "You trusted me when no one else would. That means something." He glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "You're not so bad yourself. For an alien." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Careful, engineer. I might start thinking you like me." Ethan smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Maybe I do." Liara's gaze lingered on him, and for a moment, the weight of the past days seemed to fade. "Well," she said, standing, "if you ever need someone to save the day again, You know where to find me." As she walked toward the door, Ethan called after her, "Lyra." She turned, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light. "Thanks," he said simply. Her lips curved into a mischievous smirk. "Don't mention it, engineer." And with that, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the faint hope that their paths would cross again. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, life aboard the Nebula Hawk returned to a semblance of normalcy. Repairs were completed, and the crew resumed their mission. But for Ethan Blake, everything had changed. He found himself looking at the stars differently, wondering what other challenges and alliances might lie ahead. And though he would never admit it, he couldn't help but hope that Lyra would be there when the next adventure began.